The RDNA 2 architecture was AMD's most far-reaching in years. It spanned the dizzying heights of the RX 6950 XT down to the murky depths of the RX 6400. It even made its way to the integrated graphics inside Ryzen 6000 and 7000 series mobile APUs. Each of these GPUs has been well known and well documented over the last couple of years, all except one. I didn't know about the RX 6300 until about a month ago. Though I was aware that a GPU by that name existed, I enjoy reading Tech Power-Up's database as much as the next perfectly normal, emotionally healthy man. The RX 6300 is listed on the GPU Bible as being never released, so I never thought to investigate further. It wasn't until a commenter talked about it in a way that definitely suggested that it existed and could be purchased that I decided to check for myself. Does it in fact exist? Can it be purchased? Well, it didn't exactly take much investigation. Sure enough, the OEM exclusive Dell branded RX 6300 was listed on eBay for a relatively low £60, and in a momentary lapse of impulse control, I clicked the Buy Now button. To date, RDNA 2 remains the only fully fleshed out GPU series produced under the AMD brand that uses a single architecture across every SKU. Until recently, I thought that the RX 6400 was the lowest end model of the range, but this one is actually a step further down the ladder. Or worse, if you prefer. The RX 6300 is an RDNA 2 based card with 12 compute units for a total of 768 shader units, 48 TMUs and 32 ROPs, and uses a PCIe Gen 4x4 interface. All exactly the same as the RX 6400. There are, however, several key differences that will affect how the 6300 compares against its more mainstream sibling. First, most noticeably, is the VRAM. Not only is there only 2GB of the stuff, it's lower clocked and runs on only a 32-bit bus. Yeah, if you thought the 64-bit bus of the 6400 and 6500 XT was stingy, you're not wrong, but this is even more so. AMD's justification for the cut-back bandwidth of those cards was the Infinity Cache, and of course the 6300 has its own slice of Infinity, which happens to be half the size of the one found in the 6400. Finally, the base, boost and game clocks of the 6300 are dramatically lower than the 6400, and the rather puny heatsink doesn't look like it's expecting much trouble. When it came to testing this card, there was something of a roadblock that I wasn't prepared for. AMD have kept the RX 6300 secret enough that the official Adrenaline driver package didn't even recognise it and refused to install. Even temporarily switching out the 6300 for another AMD card to install the drivers didn't work, and the only official source I could find online was the Dell website, which, in true OEM fashion, had nothing more up to date than last June. My saving grace came in the form of Immernimme Zone, or RID as it's now known. The latest custom version of the beta drivers from RID gave me a black screen, but their version of the 23.12.1 set proved to be fully functional, and other than being recognised as a 6500 XT series, this ugly duckling of the RDNA 2 family was in business. To test the RX 6300, I brought in the newly updated 2024 moderately priced gaming PC. Although this year's revision of the MPG PC is still firmly in the mid-range category, with a total value of around £600 excluding the GPU, it is now very much up to date. The CPU is the Ryzen 5 7500F, paired with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR5 6000 CL30, and installed on an MSI B650 Gaming Plus motherboard. While the choice of CPU and RAM won't have much performance impact on a lower-end GPU like this one, the fact that it has Gen 4 PCI Express and Smart Access Memory will. PCs with only a Gen 3 PCIe bus will probably see somewhat worse performance than this. While the rest of my test suite consists of mostly modern releases, the RX 6300 is something of an unknown quantity. Other than synthetic benchmarks, which are at the end of the video, I felt like it was worth starting with GTA 5, as a title people will be familiar with. At 1080p high settings, without advanced graphics options, I saw a very acceptable 72 FPS, with lows of 52. I felt like there might have been room to push settings a little further, but I found I was skating dangerously close to the 2GB VRAM limit. And not for the last time in this video. Moving on to the modern games, starting with, I think that's Alan Wake 2? The game where you play the human person with the 3 letters on their jacket? Might be P81. Anyway, as you can tell, this is astonishingly bad. Technically, the RX 6300 supports DX12 Ultimate, which is why Agent Anderson isn't a floating head, as I saw on the Radeon 7, but the 2GB frame buffer is causing all kinds of streaming issues, and the frame rate's intolerably bad too. With FSR performance enabled, I saw 16 FPS, and dropping to Ultra Performance only increased that to 20. This is actually my first experience with Avatar. The game launches straight into an in-engine set of company logos, which are all beautifully rendered with many, many pixels, and before I've even had the chance to choose quality settings, the intro cutscene starts playing with some automatically chosen defaults. Surprisingly, the game doesn't look awful at this point. Okay, I just finished testing Alan Wake. I was feeling easily impressed. Once I got to the setup screen, however, I could tell this was going to be a bloodbath once I reached the open world. The built-in benchmark recorded just under 10 FPS at these default settings, which turned out to be 1080 low with FSR performance. After dropping output resolution to 720p, I got my best result of 14, which made me conclude that it wasn't worth testing any further. I run the same test each time in Starfield. I have my reasons for choosing this early section that's mostly conversations. It's not so demanding on the CPU, unlike walking around in New Atlantis, and it's easily repeatable. It's also usually a bit more demanding on the GPU than regular gameplay, but not in this instance. I obtained a near cinematic average of 23.5 FPS at 1080 low with 50% scaling. However, I went for a quick mosey over to a barren planet for a mission, and the frame rate was, if anything, a bit lower. Dropping to 720 might give a more playable frame rate, but given how muddy it looks at 1080, I would hesitate to call anything of this experience playable. I want to be enthusiastic about the RX 6300's performance in Resident Evil 4, but I don't think I can. On the one hand, using the performance priority preset at 720p with FSR performance and textures set to the lowest setting, I got, wait for it, 63 FPS! Bloody amazing! I certainly didn't expect this from a 2023 game, but there's probably a catch. You see, at these settings, the menu warned me I was going to use 2.25GB of VRAM, and no amount of tweaking in the settings could get that number out of the red zone. I didn't experience a crash this time, but on plenty of occasions in the past, when I've tried to exceed the amount of VRAM the graphics card has on hand, RE4 Remake has dumped me to the desktop. I have a feeling that with the RX 6300 installed, it's just a matter of time before that happens again. Once more, I have to ask, what the hell? Can I be cautiously optimistic twice in a row? The Last of Us isn't known for being kind to low-end hardware, so I wasn't expecting 60 FPS. In fact, I was expecting a crash, or at best, something like we saw in Alan Wake 2. I actually saw a fairly console-esque 33 FPS, with lows only as far as 25. I mean, don't get it twisted, quality is of course appalling, and the VRAM indicator in the menu suggested that I owed it about another 2.5 gigs, so I would expect major stutters and hang-ups at some point in the gameplay experience, but for this one beautiful moment, I had a low-end GPU running a playable FPS in The Last of Us. Yeah, it wasn't gonna last, was it? I actually laughed out loud when the intro to Ratchet and Clank ended, and I was dropped into the ugliest mess of over-sharpened pixels I think I've ever seen. This is, I'd argue, one of the best-looking games to hit PC in the last year, and it's a crying shame to see it like this. It's even worse to play. At 1080 minimum settings with FSR Ultra Performance, meaning this is actually 360p upscaled, I saw almost 15 FPS. If you're surprised that Cyberpunk 2077 is actually more playable than some of the games on this list, I have some bad news for you. This game's over 3 years old now. Considering the concept of this series is to test old hardware in the latest games, I'm not even sure why it's still in my lineup. Anyway, 1080 low looks fine these days, as CDPR have tweaked it to be less ugly but more demanding as a result. It only takes FSR balanced to ensure a 30 plus average. Pushing to medium and dropping FSR to performance doesn't harm the average too much, but it takes a toll on the frame rates, so I'd recommend sticking to low in this case. Another oldie. I intended to switch Forza Horizon 5 out for Motorsport this year, but I can't bring myself to deal with the Xbox Game Pass app, and I'm not going to spend 60 quid on the Steam version if the reception's as bad as YouTube suggests. Anyway, I like Horizon 5, and it's notoriously scalable across a range of hardware. However, it also expects more VRAM than this. Each run at 1080p, be it low or medium, gave a memory warning, so while they gave averages of 40 and 30 FPS respectively, I don't expect to get far before the game quits out and tells me to buy a better graphics card. You can probably get a better experience out of Fortnite by using performance mode, but unless I'm benchmarking a CPU, things have to get pretty bad before I resort to it. Like, I use performance mode for testing Intel iGPUs, and whatever I think of the RX 6300, it's not that bad. It's not at all surprising that the 6300 can handle Fortnite at 1080 low in DX12 with epic view distance and TAA, and still give an average FPS of almost 67. 1% lows are a good 30 FPS below this, however, and while that may have something to do with the good old-fashioned Fortnite stutter, it could also be related to the VRAM. Finally, Call of Duty Warzone was another title in which I couldn't get the VRAM indicator out of the red zone. I did, however, manage to get it to exactly the 1.95GB mark by running at 720p minimum quality with 90% resolution scaling, and this gave a pretty palatable, almost Fortnite-like experience with a roughly 66 FPS average and 1% lows in the 30s. I also couldn't see a damned thing, which is something of a drawback in a game that tends to attract people of a sniping disposition. So, now that I've unearthed AMD's dirty little secret, the RDNA family member they were content to keep buried in Dell pre-builts where no enthusiast would ever find them, was it worth it? No, not at all. The RX 6300 is a strong argument for better integrated graphics. In fact, the Radeon 780M iGPU is about 50 to 100% more performant than this, and I have a couple of Ryzen-based mini PCs coming in the next few weeks. The card is locked down to the point where it can't be overclocked or even have different performance profiles selected in either Radeon software or MSI Afterburner. Otherwise, perhaps there might be something here to make it worth the £60 to £70 asking price. And maybe there is something. I ran out of time for this video, but perhaps in the future I'll look into modifying the BIOS and see if I can squeeze some more performance from AMD's black sheep. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.